The thing about frostbite that most people misunderstand is this. Frostbite does not happen because the air is cold. Frostbite happens because your body cannot keep your extremities warm enough to prevent the tissue from freezing, and the primary reason your body cannot keep your extremities warm is not the temperature outside, but the moisture inside. Wet feet freeze. Dry feet survive. This is the fundamental truth of cold weather survival that the Scottish Highlanders learned over centuries of living in one of the wettest and windiest climates in Europe. A climate that combined cold temperatures with constant rain and snow and bog water that soaked through every barrier and turned feet into frozen lumps of dead tissue if you did not know how to keep them dry. The American settlers of the Montana frontier in the 1880s did not know this truth. They knew that cold weather was dangerous. They knew that their feet got cold in winter. They knew that sometimes people lost toes or entire feet to frostbite, and they assumed this was simply the price of living in a harsh climate, a risk that could be minimized by wearing thick socks and heavy boots, but never entirely eliminated. They did not understand that the thick wool socks they wore absorbed sweat from their feet and held that moisture against their skin, creating a damp environment that conducted heat away from their bodies 25 times faster than dry air would. They did not understand that their heavy leather boots, designed to keep external moisture out, also kept internal moisture in, trapping the sweat that their feet produced during the exertion of winter work. They did not understand that the combination of thick socks and tight boots and hard labor in cold weather created the perfect conditions for frostbite, conditions that had nothing to do with how cold the air was and everything to do with how wet their feet were. Angus MacLeod understood. He had grown up in the Scottish Highlands, in a village where the men worked outdoors in all weather, herding sheep across mountains that were cold and wet and windy for 8 months of every year. He had learned, before he was old enough to question the learning, that you lined your boots with sphagnum moss before you went out in winter, and you changed the moss when it became saturated, and you never, ever walked in cold weather with wet feet because wet feet were dead feet waiting to die. The moss was the secret. Sphagnum moss, the plant that grew in bogs across Scotland and across the world wherever conditions were wet enough to support it, had properties that made it the perfect material for keeping feet dry in cold weather. It could absorb up to 20 times its own weight in water, which meant it pulled moisture away from the skin rather than holding it against the skin the way wool socks did. It was naturally antimicrobial, containing compounds that prevented the growth of bacteria and fungi that caused infections in damp conditions. It was an excellent insulator, trapping air in its cellular structure, the same way that feathers trapped air in a bird's plumage. And it was free, growing wild in any bog, available in unlimited quantities to anyone who knew what it was and what it could do. Angus had used sphagnum moss to line his boots since childhood. His father had taught him, and his grandfather had taught his father, and the knowledge stretched back through generations of MacLeods who had survived Highland winters that killed men who did not know the old ways. When he came to Montana in 1882, following the promise of land and opportunity that drew so many immigrants west, he brought this knowledge with him the way he brought his few possessions and his wife Moira, and the certainty that he could survive anything if he remembered what the Highlands had taught him. If you want to understand how a Scottish immigrant used bog moss to keep his feet from freezing while his neighbors lost toes and limbs to frostbite that was entirely preventable, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The first thing Angus did when he arrived in Montana was look for bogs. This puzzled his neighbors, who could not understand why a man would walk for miles across the mountain slopes, searching for wet ground when there was dry ground available everywhere. Montana had forests and prairies and mountains, all of which seemed more useful than the soggy depressions where water collected and strange plants grew in conditions that seemed more suited to Scotland than to the American West. But Angus found what he was looking for. In the high valleys fed by snowmelt and spring water, there were bogs where sphagnum moss grew in thick carpets of green and gold. The moss was the same genus as the Scottish variety, adapted to local conditions but functionally identical, capable of absorbing moisture and insulating feet and preventing the frostbite that the long Montana winters would otherwise guarantee. He harvested the moss in autumn, when it was mature and the summer's growth had filled it with the cellular structure that made it effective. He dried it partially, reducing its water content without destroying its absorbent properties. He stored it in burlap sacks in his barn, enough to last the winter, enough to line his boots fresh every day if necessary. And he waited for the cold to come. The first winter passed without incident. Angus's feet stayed warm and dry. He changed his moss linings every few days, replacing the saturated material with fresh dry moss, maintaining the barrier between his feet and the moisture that would otherwise freeze them. His neighbors, who wore thick wool socks and heavy leather boots, complained of cold feet and occasional numbness, but did not connect these symptoms to the moisture accumulating inside their boots. Clayton Burris was the loudest voice of mockery. Burris owned the largest ranch in the county, a spread of several thousand acres where he ran cattle and employed a dozen hands who did the actual work while he collected the profits. He had made his money in mining before turning to ranching, and he considered himself an expert on all matters related to survival in the Montana wilderness. "The Scotsman puts weeds in his boots," Burris announced at the general store one day, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I saw him out at the bog, gathering handfuls of that swamp moss like it was gold. He stuffs it in his boots and walks around squelching like a duck. The man is touched in the head, mark my words." The laughter rippled through the store. The Scottish immigrant, with his strange accent and his stranger habits, was an easy target for men who wanted to feel superior without having to prove anything. Angus was present, but did not respond. He had learned that arguing with wealthy men accomplished nothing. The moss would prove itself when winter came in earnest. The winter of 1886 to 87 was the worst in Montana's recorded history. It began in November with a blizzard that dropped 3 feet of snow across the territory, followed by a cold snap that drove temperatures to 40 below zero and kept them there for weeks. The cattle that ranchers had left on the open range, trusting that they would survive the winter as they had survived previous winters, began to die by the thousands. They froze standing up, their bodies forming the gruesome monuments that would give the season its name, the Great Die-Up. But the cattle were not the only victims. The men who tried to save them, who rode out into the killing cold to move herds to shelter, to break ice on water sources, to distribute hay to animals that were too weak to forage through the snow, these men suffered too. They suffered because they were working hard in conditions that their equipment was not designed to handle. They were sweating inside their heavy clothes, generating moisture that their thick wool socks absorbed and held against their feet. They were riding horses that kicked up snow that melted on their boots and seeped through every seam. They were dismounting to do work that required walking through drifts that came up to their knees, soaking their boots with snow that their body heat melted into water that then froze against their skin. The frostbite began within days of the first hard cold. Men came back from cattle rescue missions with feet that were numb and white, the first stage of freezing that could still be reversed if caught in time. Some of them caught it in time, warming their feet gradually, suffering only pain and peeling skin as the tissue recovered. Others did not catch it in time. Others continued working because the cattle needed saving, and there was no one else to save them, and by the time they stopped to rest, the white numbness had turned to black death. The first amputation happened on December 15th. Thomas Greer, one of Burris's ranch hands, lost 3 toes on his right foot to frostbite that had progressed beyond any possibility of recovery. The doctor who performed the amputation said that Greer was lucky, that if he had waited another day, he would have lost the entire foot, and if he had waited 2 days, he would have lost his life to the gangrene that frostbite inevitably caused when left untreated. The second amputation happened on December 20th, the third on December 23rd. By Christmas, 4 men in the county had lost toes or feet to frostbite, and a dozen more were being treated for frostbite that had not yet progressed to the point of requiring surgery. The doctor was overwhelmed. The ranchers were terrified, and Clayton Burris, who had mocked the Scotsman's bog moss just months earlier, was starting to notice that Angus MacLeod was the only man working outdoors who never showed any sign of frostbite at all. The confrontation happened on the day after Christmas, when Burris rode to the MacLeod homestead with a proposition that was half request and half demand. "MacLeod," Burris said, not bothering to dismount, not bothering with pleasantries. "Your feet, they have not frozen." "How?" "Moss," Angus replied. He was standing in his doorway, having answered Burris's knock with the caution that isolated settlers developed when unexpected visitors arrived. "Sphagnum moss. I line my boots with it. It absorbs the moisture from my feet and keeps them dry. Dry feet do not freeze." Burris stared at him. "The same moss you were gathering at the bog last autumn. The moss I said was weeds. The moss I laughed at you for collecting." Yes, the laughter had stopped. Burris's face had gone through several expressions, settling finally on something that might have been humility, if humility were possible for a man who had spent his life believing he knew better than everyone around him. "I need that moss," Burris said. "My men are losing feet. I have had to send 3 of them to town for surgery, and 2 more will follow if this cold continues. I cannot run a ranch with crippled hands. I need what you have." Angus considered the request. He had no love for Burris, who had mocked him publicly and treated him as a fool for practicing the survival techniques that his ancestors had perfected over centuries. But the men who were losing their feet were not Burris. They were working men, laborers who had no choice but to do what their employer demanded, who were suffering because no one had taught them what Angus had learned before he could walk. "I will teach you," Angus said finally. "Not sell. Teach. The moss is free for anyone who knows where to find it and how to use it. I will show your men what to do, but you must come to learn, not to take. This knowledge was given to me by my father, and I will give it the same way, as a gift that creates obligation. You will owe me nothing except the promise to teach others when they need to learn." Burris accepted, though the acceptance clearly cost him. He was not accustomed to receiving gifts, especially from men he had dismissed as fools. He was not accustomed to owing obligations that could not be settled with money, but his men were losing their feet, and his cattle were dying, and he was not so proud that he would let his ranch collapse rather than learn from an immigrant who knew something he did not. The teaching began that afternoon. Angus led Burris and a dozen of his men to the bog where he had harvested his moss supply, showing them how to identify sphagnum among the other bog plants, how to harvest it without destroying the colony, how to squeeze out the excess water and prepare it for use. He demonstrated how to line a boot, packing the moss loosely around the foot rather than compressing it, creating air pockets that would provide insulation while allowing the moss to absorb moisture. He explained the science as much as he understood it, that wet feet froze because water conducted heat away from the body, that dry feet stayed warm because air was a poor conductor of heat, that the moss kept feet dry by absorbing sweat rather than letting it accumulate against the skin. The men listened with the desperate attention of people who had seen friends lose limbs to a problem they had not understood. They asked questions that showed they were thinking, not just memorizing. They practiced the technique until Angus was satisfied that they could do it correctly on their own. And then they went back to work, their boots lined with moss, their feet protected by knowledge that had traveled 4,000 miles from the Scottish Highlands to save them from the frostbite that had seemed inevitable. The results were immediate and dramatic. The frostbite cases stopped. The men who had been developing early symptoms found that their feet were warm and dry for the first time since the cold snap began. The men who had been healthy stayed healthy, their moss-lined boots providing protection that their wool socks had never offered. By the end of January, when the worst of the cold had finally broken, not a single man who had adopted the moss technique had suffered any frostbite at all. The men who had lost toes before learning the technique were bitter about the timing. If they had known a month earlier, they said, they would still have all their toes. If someone had taught them before the cold came, rather than after the damage was done, they would not be crippled for life. They did not blame Angus, who had used the technique openly all along and had never hidden his knowledge from anyone who asked. They blamed themselves for laughing at the Scotsman instead of wondering why his feet never seemed to bother him. They blamed Burris for leading the mockery that had prevented them from taking the immigrants' methods seriously. The reckoning came in March, when the snow began to melt and the survivors could gather to assess what the winter had cost them. The Great Die-Up had killed hundreds of thousands of cattle across Montana and the surrounding territories. The human cost was smaller, but no less tragic. 11 men in the county had lost toes or feet to frostbite, and 2 had died of the gangrene that followed. Every one of those casualties had occurred before Angus shared his moss technique. Every one of those losses was preventable. The gathering was held at the county seat, a meeting of ranchers and townspeople, and anyone else who wanted to understand what had happened and how to prevent it from happening again. Angus did not want to attend. He was not comfortable with attention, preferred to work quietly, and let his results speak for themselves. But Moira insisted, and the men whose feet he had saved insisted, and finally he agreed to come and explain what he knew. Clayton Burris spoke first. This surprised everyone, because Burris was not a man who admitted mistakes, not a man who gave credit to others, not a man who stood before a crowd and confessed to having been wrong about anything. But he stood up, and he spoke, and what he said changed the way the county thought about immigrant knowledge forever. Last summer, Burris said, I stood in the general store and mocked Angus MacLeod for gathering moss from the bog. I called it weeds. I called him touched in the head. I laughed at his Scottish ways and encouraged others to laugh with me. He stopped, his face working through emotions that his pride was struggling to contain. This winter, I lost 3 men to frostbite. 3 men who will never walk normally again, who will never work a full day again, who will carry the evidence of my ignorance in their bodies for the rest of their lives. And the reason I lost them is because I was too proud to ask a Scottish immigrant why his feet never seemed to freeze when everyone else's did. He looked at Angus, who sat in the back row with Moira, uncomfortable with the attention, but unwilling to flee. MacLeod tried to tell us, not in words, maybe, but in actions. He gathered moss while we laughed. He lined his boots while we wore thick socks that trapped moisture against our skin. He stayed healthy while we froze. And we laughed at him because it was easier to laugh than to learn. Burris paused. I will not laugh again. I will not dismiss knowledge because it comes from a foreigner, or because it seems strange, or because it is different from what I have always done. I have paid for that arrogance with other men's feet, and that is a price I will not pay twice. When Burris finished, Angus walked to the front of the gathering. He had not prepared remarks, had not expected to be called upon to speak, but he understood that something needed to be said that would make the lesson stick. In Scotland, he said, we have a saying, "He who laughs at the old ways dies in the new weather." It means that the knowledge of our ancestors was earned with blood, that they learned what worked by watching people die from what did not work, that their traditions are not superstition, but survival. He held up a handful of dried sphagnum moss that he had brought from his supply. This is not a weed. This is not primitive. This is engineering, perfected over centuries, that my great-great-grandfather used, and his great-great-grandfather used before him. The moss absorbs moisture. Dry feet do not freeze. The principle is simple. The technique is simple. The only complicated thing is overcoming the pride that makes people dismiss what they do not understand. He looked around the room at the ranchers and townspeople who had gathered to learn from the winter that had nearly destroyed them. The bogs in these mountains are full of this moss. It grows everywhere that water collects and conditions are right. Anyone can harvest it. Anyone can use it. There is no cost except the labor of gathering, and that labor costs less than a single toe lost to frostbite. I will teach anyone who wants to learn, just as I taught Mr. Burris's men when they finally asked. But I cannot teach people who are too proud to ask, and I cannot save feet that freeze while their owners are laughing at the old ways that would have protected them. The phrase Highland moss entered the vocabulary of the Montana frontier that spring and spread across the northern territories. It meant sphagnum moss used for boot insulation, but it also meant something more. It meant traditional knowledge that worked even when modern methods failed. It meant immigrant wisdom that deserved respect rather than mockery. It meant the willingness to learn from anyone who had survived conditions that you had not yet faced. The following winter, there were no frostbite amputations in the county. The ranchers who had laughed at Angus's bog harvesting now gathered moss themselves, storing it in their barns the way Angus stored his, lining their boots every morning before going out into the cold. The technique spread to neighboring counties, then to neighboring territories, carried by word of mouth from men who had learned the hard way that mockery costs more than humility. Angus MacLeod lived on his Montana homestead for another 27 years, passing in the autumn of 1914 at the age of 79. Moira survived him by 3 years, maintaining the traditions they had brought from Scotland until she joined him in the small cemetery on the hill above their homestead. The bog where Angus had gathered his moss still produces sphagnum every year, and a few old-timers in the county still harvest it for boot insulation, though most have switched to modern synthetic materials that work nearly as well without the labor of gathering. Above the door of the MacLeod cabin, preserved now by the County Historical Society, Angus carved an inscription in both Gaelic and English in the year after the Great Die-Up. when the county had finally understood what he had been trying to show them all along. The inscription reads, Casan Tiorum, Crede Blath, dry feet, warm heart. The men who had laughed at his moss gathering, who had watched their friends lose feet, while the Scotsman walked healthy through the worst winter in Montana history, they understood exactly what those words meant. And if you learned something from this story about sphagnum moss and moisture management and the highland wisdom that kept one man's feet intact while his neighbors lost theirs to frostbite, subscribe to this channel, because we have more stories about the forgotten survival techniques that kept people alive before modern technology made everyone forget what the old ways knew. The bogs are still there. The moss still grows. The only question is whether we are humble enough to learn from the people who learned first.